Good morning. Welcome to Tour of the Bible Day 8, which makes us 1 week in. And today we're going to be looking at the book of Joshua. I wondered if it'd be helpful just to do a very quick recap of the story so far. After the story of creation and fall, we begin with Abraham. God calls one person, one family, in order to bless the whole world. Abraham eventually has Isaac and then eventually has 12 great grandsons who are going to become the fathers, if you like, of the 12 tribes of Israel. The family goes down to Egypt, and 400 years later they are a great people group who are brought out of Egypt, brought out of slavery in Egypt by God through Moses. They are brought through the Red Sea into the desert. God makes a covenant with them at Sinai and gives them laws, reveals his character to them. They balk at entering the promised land at that point, so they wander in the desert for 40 years, and the older generation die out, and it is the younger generation, now under the leadership of Joshua, who are going to take the promised land, which of course in geographical terms is the current land of Israel, Palestine. So today we're in the book of Joshua, and let me just give you an overview of the contents. In brief, essentially we have, this is an account of conquest and land allocation, sandwiched between, it's a kind of thick sandwich between 3 covenant renewals, one at the beginning, one roughly in the middle, and one towards the end. In a little more detail, I'm going to give you 2 tours of this book. I'm going to give you one which is the kind of dominant narrative of the book, and then in a minute I'm going to give you a kind of slightly subversive counter narrative, but I'll show you that as we get there. So the dominant narrative of the book. Chapter 1, Joshua is affirmed as leader. There's a kind of almost a liturgical conversation between him and the people of Israel where they keep saying to him, be strong and courageous. The Lord your God is with you. Then the people in chapter 4 cross the Jordan, and when they cross the Jordan, so the Jordan is physically the physical barrier between them and the nation of Canaan, the land of Canaan, I should say, so they physically have to cross it. But the way they cross it is that the Ark of the Covenant is taken in by the priests, and when the priests set foot in the river stops flowing and it heaps upriver, is that the right language? The water kind of heaps up and the people cross on dry land. Now this is intentionally there to remind us of the Red Sea narrative, and it is almost as if I think in terms of the story, it kind of collapses the timeline, and it's, the people come out of Egypt, they pass through water which miraculously passes for them, and they go into the land. And the Red Sea and the Jordan, because of their similarity, they are kind of collapsed together in this motif. Then in chapter 5 we get the first kind of covenant renewal. It's the circumcision of the new generation who haven't been circumcised in the desert but need to be in order to be legal before God, really, as the people of Israel. You'll remember, I hope, that Abraham was told to circumcise himself and Isaac. It's the mark of the covenant in the human flesh. So they do that in chapter 5. Then in chapter 6 we have the very well-known story of the Battle of Jericho. And in case that's not familiar, it's might be the one you want to read today if you're going to read a little bit. But essentially Jericho is taken it's taken by a mighty act of God. The people walk around this city, which is a walled city. You need to imagine it, think a little bit more like a medieval city, a walled city, shut up against them. The people walk around once on the first day, they walk around once on the second day, and so on for 6 days they do that. On the 7th day they walk around 7 times. Then they blow their horns and they shout a battle cry, and the walls fall, at which point the people go in and conquer the city. So that's the story, very briefly, of the Battle of Jericho. Then we get the conquest of Ai in chapter 8, which is by no means so straightforward. And what happens there is that there's been some disobedience And as a result, when they go up against Ai, they are defeated in the first instance. And actually suffer quite heavy battle losses in the first instance. And it's only later that they are successful in conquering Ai. Then there is another great covenant renewal, and I foolishly haven't written down the chapter. Oh, it's in chapter 8. The covenant is renewed on Mount Ebal, and there is a liturgical reenactment of the covenant blessings and cursings from Deuteronomy 28, which we looked at yesterday. You may remember in Deuteronomy 28 we had, these are the ways I will bless you, says God, if you keep the covenant. These are the ways I will curse you if you fail to keep the covenant. And actually he tells them, when you go into the land, this is what you're to do. Half of the nation to stand on Mount Gerizim and pronounce the blessings, and half of you to stand on Mount Ebal and pronounce the curses. And this is what happens at the end of chapter 8. We get this great kind of liturgical recitation of the blessings and the curses, and a reaffirmation then of the covenant. In chapter 10, we get one of the classic stories of Joshua, where Joshua and the people are fighting against 5 kings who are aggressively coming against him. By no means are the people of Israel always the aggressors in this story. And as they are fighting, Joshua, they start to win. Nightfall is approaching. They realise that battle is going to have to end with nightfall. Joshua declares that the sun must stand still, and the sun, according to the narrative, the sun stands still while Joshua completes the conquest of that particular battle, completes the battle victory. Chapters 10 to 12, then, we get an account of one battle victory after another after another. Chapters 14 to 21, the nation then starts to divvy up the land initially according to tribe, and then according to each clan then takes a part of the land. I mentioned a few days ago that the Levites don't get an allocation of land. They are supposed to be spread throughout the land and have little patches in every territory. This is because the role of priesthood, remember that the Levites are the priestly tribe, the role of priesthood is for the blessing of the people, and so it is important that they are disseminated through the nation rather than being bunched together in one particular place. Then in chapter 22, the eastern tribes return home. You may remember that when they approached the land, as they were waiting to go in, the tribe of Reuben, the tribe of Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh approached Moses and said, actually, we like the land on the east of the Jordan. Can we settle here, please? And Moses said, yes, but you must help with the conquest when the time comes. And this is what has happened. The fighting men of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh have helped with the conquest. And then in 22, they are sent home back to their families, having completed the conquest. In chapter 24, we get another covenant renewal, this time at Shechem. Shechem is going to become quite an important cultic centre. When I use the word cult, that means the apparatus of religious worship. It's not talking about what we might think of as cults today. So Shechem is an important cultic centre, and it's the place where the covenant is renewed in chapter 24. And then in chapters 23 and 24, Joshua says farewell, makes a kind of farewell speech to the nation, and then he dies. And that's the kind of prevailing narrative of the book of Joshua. Let me talk a little bit about one particular word that we encounter quite a lot in the Hebrew, and it's variously translated depending on what Bible translation you're using. Now, the Hebrew word is Herem. And Herem will be translated in your Bible as something like totally destroy, or utterly annihilate, or possibly devote, completely devote. It'll be something like that. It is often assumed, and you meet it a lot in the book of Joshua. Now, it's often assumed that the word Herem equates to slaughter, and it doesn't. It doesn't equate to slaughter for a number of reasons. The most easy reason is that you can Herem things as well as people. So clearly it doesn't just mean kill. It doesn't just mean destroy either, which would, I guess, map to kill when you're talking about people. Because things that are designated Herem are sometimes put outside the camp. And if you remember that idea of graded holiness we spoke about in Leviticus, outside the camp is where you put things that are abominable. So sometimes things that are Herem are put outside the camp. Sometimes they are brought into the sanctuary, into the tabernacle. And that's the place, of course, where things that are most holy are brought. Now, what do things that are utterly abominable have in common with things that are totally holy? What do things that are outside the camp have in common with things that are within the tabernacle? And I think the answer is they are both untouchable. They are both things that you separate from yourself. And the base idea of Herem, which is it's a word that continues to, that it has, so all the Semitic languages are linked, Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic, and a number of others. And this little word Herem has its echoes even in modern Arabic today, and in English actually. So the word Herem is a place where women are put apart, they're put aside from normal society for the benefits of the king. It's all rather nasty and toxic, but the idea of being separated still lies there today. The Arabic word haram, which means forbidden, is also connected with this idea of being put aside, put apart from normal life. So the base idea behind Herem is separation from normal use. Now, this means, therefore, that the people of Israel cannot intermarry with the other nations, because that would be, that might be kind of normal use. That's kind of normal human interaction, is that people get married to each other. And the Herem order forbids intermarriage. So it's kind of, that is the base idea. Now, I wish I could tell you that meant nobody got killed and we've completely misunderstood the book of Joshua. And I don't think that's the case. I think clearly deaths happened. Clearly there were battle conquests and people got killed. But the root idea is not you must go and slaughter, but you must separate these people. You must not react, not interrelate with them in a normal way. Now, hold that thought, because what I want to show you now is another narrative that is contained within the book of Joshua. And if you felt the first one was quite aggressive and quite violent, then I agree with you. I think it is. But this one I'm going to show you now is quite subversive against that aggressive, violent narrative. So let me show you some things, and holding what I said about Herem in your mind. The first part of this counter-narrative is the story of Rahab. Now, you may well be familiar with the story of Rahab, but let me just recap it quickly to you. Rahab is a prostitute. She's a Canaanite, not an Israelite. She lives in the city of Jericho. And when Joshua sends 2 spies to check out the city and, evaluate its military preparedness, Rahab protects them. She shelters them and she conceals them from men who are hunting them. But not only does she do that, but she actually makes a really extraordinary statement of faith in the true God. She says this is chapter 2, verse 11. The Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. Now that statement of faith is only made by 2 other people in the entire Hebrew Bible, and off the top of my head, it's Moses and Solomon. So this pagan female prostitute, who you might think as being kind of the most, untouchable, the most lowest of the low in the mind of the ancient writer, actually makes this extraordinary statement of faith. And on the basis of that statement of faith, she acts, she protects the spies, and she gets a promise from them. And the promise is that when they destroy the city, that they will save her and her family. Now, listen a little bit more to what happens. So the spies say, very well, we will save you and your family. Your family must all shelter in your house. And then you must hang a red cord in the window. Now, her window is in the wall of the city, because that's where her house is built into the wall of the city. So if you were the destroying army and you were approaching Rahab's house, your natural point of entrance to Rahab's house would be through her window, not through her doorway, which would be from the inside of the city. So that means that as the destroyer coming up, you see a red thing hanging over the point of ingress, the point of entrance, and you do not go in to destroy, and everyone that is within that house is saved. Now, I don't know if that sounds familiar to you, but that sounds to me very much like the Passover account, where the destroying angel passes over the city, the houses that have the blood around, the red blood around the doorposts. I think what we have going on here is a kind of Passover event for Rahab and her family. There are many points of similarity. So that's the first really surprising point of counter-narrative, of an alternative narrative, that Rahab, this pagan woman, is protected by this kind of Passover-like event, and, I should add, is brought into the heart of the nation. And the text is quite explicit about that. She's not just kind of left in the kind of hinterland, but she's brought into the heart of the nation. And those of us who know a little bit more about how the story unfolds may know that she then makes her way into King David's family line. She's King David's great-grandmother. I'm not sure how many greats, something like that. And by that means into Jesus Christ's family line. That's the first story. That's a counter-narrative. The second is the story of Achan in Joshua 7. Now, Achan is the man who has stolen things that are supposed to be Herem, supposed to be so he's taken booty, basically, which he wasn't allowed to in the Battle of Jericho, and he's hidden it. And when he's discovered, he is taken outside the camp. Now we know what outside the camp means. It's where you put things that you are separating. It's where you put things that are abominable. It's where you put things that are Herem. And the language is, and because he has stolen something that is supposed to be Herem, supposed to be set aside, dedicated in this way, then actually he becomes Herem instead, and he is stoned to death. And the Achan story is kind of the exact opposite of the Rahab story. Rahab is a woman who has faith in God even though she's outside the nation and therefore is brought in. Achan is a man who is within the nation, and yet his disobedience puts him outside. And so now we're starting to get this hint that belonging to the people of God is not simply about blood, but there is something about faith that matters as well. This is an important emerging part of the story. And then we get the story of the Gibeonites. I love the story of the Gibeonites, chapter 9. And the Gibeonites do a little bit like what Rahab does. The Gibeonites are also called the Hivites, and they are one of the 7 people groups that are supposed to be Heremed by Joshua. And they lie to Joshua, they deceive him. They pretend that they have travelled a very long way. You know, we heard of you, we heard of your great conquests from a great distance, and we've travelled a long way to make peace with you and to beg you to make a covenant with us, you know, a non-aggression treaty with us. And Joshua is fooled by their deception, and he makes a covenant, interesting choice of language there, he makes a covenant of non-aggression with them, then discovers that they are actually one of the 7 nations that he's supposed to have and they're actually from just down the road, feels a bit duped, but keeps his covenant with them. Now, the Gibeonites have done just what Rahab has done, I think. They have, by means of trickery actually, they have discovered that God is up to something in this people, and they are determined to make themselves part of that story by hook or by crook. This is an act of faith in the God of Israel. And because of that faith, they become part actually of the nation one way or another. They work for the Israelites, and actually Joshua goes to battle to defend them just a few chapters later. Part of this counter-narrative of the boundaries of Israel, the borders of Israel, being much more porous than we might have imagined. In chapter 11, we get an account where a powerful army who have horses and chariots. Now, when you read of horses and chariots in the Hebrew Bible, this is crack military technology. Think, I don't know, Exocet missiles or something. Think about Hitler's panzer divisions against the cavalry of Poland in the Second World War. So horses and chariots are, as I say, elite military technology. And in chapter 11, when horses and chariots, an army with horses and chariots comes against Joshua and the people, then God tells them when they conquer, which they do, they are to hamstring the horses. And this is, if you like, a disabling of the crack military technology. And it is a sort of counter-narrative that this peasant people who don't have crack military technology are disabling the weapons of war, if you like. Now, in chapter 10, verse 40, we read this. Joshua subdued the whole region. Actually, it's better in the English Standard Version, which says basically the whole land was taken by Joshua. But in chapter 13, we then get a long account of land that had not been conquered. So we've got one bit of Joshua which says Joshua took the whole land, and then another bit that says, but not this bit, and not this bit, and not this bit. And we need to notice that the conquest was not complete. Now, the other question is actually what happened to people? How many people actually died? Now, here I'm going to quote from my book. I'm going to plug my book for a minute because it is, if you're interested in this question, you might want to follow up on this a little bit. So this is a book I wrote last year. It's called God of Violence Yesterday, God of Love Today, ? Very important question mark there. Wrestling honestly with the Old Testament. And it's looking at violence within the Old Testament and trying to provide some ways of understanding it. So you might be interested in that. But I just want to refer to something on page 132 of that book. So my question I want you to think about as you listen is, did everybody die when Joshua went in and put cities to Herem? Joshua 10 verse 20. When Joshua and the Israelites had finished inflicting a very great slaughter on them until they were wiped out. Well, sounds like everybody died, doesn't it? Second half of that same verse. And when the survivors had entered into the fortified towns, okay, maybe everyone didn't die. We have a kind of a narrative that says everyone died, and then another one that says, and the survivors, this is what happened to them. I'll give you one more example, but actually I've got quite a few here. Joshua 10 verse 39. Joshua took the city of Debir and utterly destroyed, there's that Herem word, every person in it. In the following chapter, Joshua came and wiped out the Anakim from Debir. Well, hang on, I thought he'd already done that. I thought everyone had already died. So there is this, what we call a tension. There is everybody died. And then there is and the survivors. Now, in terms of human behaviour, this makes sense, I think, because in terms of the military conquest, what's of interest is the cities. The cities are strategically important. It's important to take cities. You're not really interested in the agricultural settlements or the little dispersed people groups. They're not strategically important. So if you were sitting within a city watching Joshua and his army come towards you, if you are a man, a father and a husband, you are not going to sit there with your family waiting for the army to come and take the city. I think you will send your family out of the city. You may stay yourself to try and defend it. We actually see this happen in the book of Samuel, where Saul at one point sends message to a city he's about to attack, saying, I'm only interested in attacking some of you, the rest of you can go, and they do. So human behaviour suggests that people didn't hang about waiting to be wiped out. So there is this counter-narrative that the conquest was by no means as complete or as kind of total or as bloody as sometimes we imagine the book is telling us. So in just a final few minutes, what is going on in this book in theological terms? In other words, what does the writer think God is up to here? What I haven't had time to show you is that the accounts of these conquests are written in very florid, hyperbolic and stylized rhetorical ways. there was an established convention to war accounts in those days, and everybody used it. Everybody knew that when you write a war account, you kind of talk in these inflated ways of, I came and I utterly destroyed and the bodies were piled up. And it's part of the convention. And nobody imagines that that has to be an exact description of what happened in order to be a faithful account of a battle conquest. And we are familiar with this, actually. We read metaphor in, for example, the Psalms. I've spoken about one a few times. God, I saved the people with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Now, that's a metaphor. I don't think any of us thinks that God has kind of literally got this great outstretched arm that is saving people. It's a metaphor. We read it as a metaphor. We understand it's a metaphor. And we understand the truth that is conveying. We need to be equally subtle in understanding that there is another literary convention, another writing style here, which is of rhetoric and hyperbole in battle accounts. And we don't necessarily need to understand them as providing a literal and exact and descript account of casualties. What we do have in the book of Joshua, in ways that I really haven't got time to show you in detail, is we have new creation language. We have clearing of chaos, which we've talked about quite a few times now. We have the clearing of chaos. We have new creation language. We have quite a lot of the patterns of sevens. We have a lot of sevens around the Battle of Jericho. Have some other sevens in there as well. And all of this is clues that we are supposed to think about creation. So in theological terms, I think what the writer understands is happening is that God, through the people, is clearing land for another new creation event, when this new society that will form will provide a kind of, in microcosm, in miniature, will be another new place where God's order is established. We need to see that there is a kind of an ideological or theological claim to have taken the whole land. But alongside that, there is a more sober assessment of land that was actually taken and land that wasn't taken, of actual casualties and those who survived. There's so much more we could say about this book, but I hope that provides a little way into understanding something that actually is really quite deeply uncomfortable to read. I don't think it takes away all the discomfort, all the angst about God commanding violence. I think there is more work to be done. This is my own particular area of interest and research, and I continue to do work in this field. But I hope that has helped a little bit and has given you a bit of an overview of the book. And tomorrow we'll meet again and talk about Judges.